Chapter 3, Evidence Not Seen. We'd been back on Celebes working in the Bible school for nearly 5 months when on the eve of the annual conference we heard the exciting news. The post at Rotali was to be reopened and the missionaries had permission to return. In the eventuality of the war in the Far East spreading south, an interior post in New Guinea would be strategic. Already Japan had military tentacles around the throats of China and Indochina. Russell and I allowed our hearts to soar in anticipation of heading back to New Guinea as soon as the conference ended. With the mission's expansion into New Guinea and Malaysia, the administrative load continued to grow, and Dr. Jaffrey felt the need of a younger man to be his assistant. Despite his physical condition, he was diabetic, Dr. Jaffrey rose at 4 o'clock to write for the Chinese Bible magazine, of which he was editor. We were advised to be much in prayer that God would reveal his choice for the assistant field chairman. No recommendations were brought in by the allocations committee, and no nominations were made from the floor. Slips of paper were circulated, and we wrote down the name of the person the Lord had laid on our hearts. These slips were collected and counted by the tellers. Presently they returned and handed a paper to Dr. A.C. Sneed, who had come from the New York headquarters, at Dr. Jaffrey's request to chair the conference. We all waited with bated breath. I was sure I knew who I would be. He would like it and would be a good choice. Instead, Dr. Sneed read Russell's name, and it was like a death knell. We were asked to rise while they sang, "Bless them, Lord, and make them a blessing." We both burst into tears. I had to get out of there. Something was very wrong. We had pioneered the New Guinea field. It was now to be reopened. Lord, this just can't be. They've made a mistake in counting the ballots. Russell was explaining things to the Lord also, when Dr. Sneed and Dr. Jaffrey came out to find us. I think you should know that every ballot had your name on it, except yours and Darlene's. I believe you can accept it as from the Lord, counseled Dr. Sneed. Yes, said Dr. Jaffrey. You are also my choice, and it's significant that you have the unanimous backing of all your fellow missionaries. Another missionary came up to say, "When I saw you crying because you didn't want the office, you wanted to return to New Guinea, I said, that's the measure of the man, the kind we need for assistant chairman." The Lord reminded me of my commitment to go anywhere, Lord. My longing to return to New Guinea, to Imopeo, and others I surrendered to the Lord. But it is in my mystery box, and closed the lid. I would be remaining in Makassar by his appointment, and I could trust the future to him. The principal of the Bible school left for furlough, and Ernie Presswood arrived to replace him. Ernie's lovely new bride, Ruth, was appointed to language study. She has a note here that I want to read that kind of sums up what happened to the missionaries by the end. Prior to the field conference, shortly thereafter, several new missionaries joined our ranks. When hostilities ceased and the smoke of the awful conflagration had lifted, when the sound of the instruments of death were no longer heard in the land, of them only Ruth Presswood remained. Grace Dittmar, a beautiful character whom we enjoyed immensely and corresponded with after she went to Sumatra, was weakened by the ordeal of her evacuation ahead of the Japanese invaders and succumbed after reaching the States. John Wilfinger, a wholesome extrovert, returned to the Sasayap district of East Borneo after the conference. Rather than put the Christian Dayaks in a position where they would be forced to lie if they hid him from the Japanese, John voluntarily surrendered and was bayoneted to death on the island of Tarakan, just off the coast of East Borneo. Fred Jackson, a splendid pilot come missionary, fell victim to the sword of Bushido in Borneo. Helen and Andrew Sandy, gentle people, dear personal friends from St. Paul and Nyack days, had been with us in Makassar until after the birth of baby David Jerome. My last letter from Helen, from Bolongan district of East Borneo, asked me to have some dresses made for her. I was never able to deliver them. The fury of the sons of the rising sun spared neither father, nor mother, nor child. Over their graves, known and unknown, the finger of God wrote his own triumphant epitaph. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death. Revelation 12:11. Back to our story. Ernie and Russell had been schoolmates at Nyack Missionary Training Institute, then were teamed together in East Borneo. The Presswoods moved in a block from us on the same street. Our friendship flourished. Ruth and I found real rapport. The missionary staff gathered on an early December Saturday to celebrate the return of the Jaffreys from a brief Philippine holiday. The change had been good for them, and we had much to share with them of the many blessings of the past few days. The next morning, December 8, 1941, I called Russell and the Jaffreys to join me in the dining room. "Breakfast!" Time for the 7 o'clock news. Russell leaned over to turn on the radio. Pearl Harbor had been bombed by the Japanese, December 8, 1941. December 7th by Washington, D.C. time. A day that would live forever in infamy. America was now a participant in the global conflict. The reality of war hit home. We began to link the events of the past year together, trying desperately to understand what had brought about such tragedy. The violence portended much more to come. We knew we'd best learn what we could from the past to realistically prepare for the future. For years, Japan had hung in the Pacific Ocean like a giant octopus, her tentacles, her striking forces concealed. Her nation's leaders chafed under the established ratio in naval strength between the three important naval powers of the world, Great Britain, the United States, and Japan, a ratio of 5 to 5 to 3. Japan's demand for equality in naval strength with the United States and Great Britain was not acceptable to the negotiating nations. So, in defiance, Japan walked out of the Second London Naval Conference in 1935. Immediately, the militaristic leaders in the Japanese administration launched a 5-year warship construction program. 2 years later, seeking land to relieve the pressure of their burgeoning population and to expand her economy, Japan felt confident enough to spark off the China incident, which eventuated in the cruel 8-year Sino-Japanese War. A tentacle reached out, and China, already fragmented by civil war, was easy prey. The United States accepted the Japanese sinking of the U.S. gunboat Panay as an error in identification by coastal batteries and bomber pilots. Nevertheless, as a deterrent, in 1940, Congress placed economic sanctions upon the export of potential war materials to Japan. Chemicals, minerals, aircraft components, aviation gas, and lube oil, as well as all scrap iron and steel, became prohibited exports. About this time, I saw a cartoon in an American publication depicting a grinning Japanese soldier standing behind a loaded cannon pointing toward the United States. The caption read, "So you want your scrap iron back?" I cut out the cartoon. Japan was no longer a little-known remote island empire. She was a close neighbor of the Netherlands East Indies. The response of most to the possibility suggested by the cartoon was ridiculous. They wouldn't dare. They not only dared, they were prepared. Japan had a navy, an army, and an air force who had been subjected to most rigorous training, men who were disciplined to fight in the tradition of the samurai and the bushido. The fatalistic philosophy of the kamikaze enabled the air attack corps of their air force to make suicidal crashes, flying into targets in airplanes containing explosives. There were to be times when I would wonder what had happened to the noble concepts of benevolence and self-control embodied in the chivalric code of Bushido behavior. When Japan started her forays into Indochina, President Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in America. From that moment, historians record that war with Japan was predictable, inevitable, and imminent. At the Imperial Conference, presided over by Imperial Hirohito, September 6, 1941, Japan resolved to go to war with Great Britain, the United States, and Holland if their demands were not met by early October. These demands entailed closing the Burma Road, non-interference in China and Indochina, no increase of military forces in the Far East, even in a country's own possessions, and American assistance in obtaining needed raw materials and in establishing good economic relations with Thailand and the Netherlands East Indies. For these concessions, Japan agreed that it would use Indochina as a base of operation against China only, and as soon as a just peace was established in the Far East, she would pull out of Indochina. Japan further agreed to guarantee the neutrality of the Philippines. Military logistics were never my forte, but when the Premier Prince Konoye resigned and War Minister General Toho established himself with the premiership, retaining the War Ministry and assuming the portfolio of Minister for Home Affairs, it left me no doubt that the militarists were firmly entrenched in the Japanese administration. Desperately in need of oil and raw materials, Japan was looking south at the Netherlands East Indies, rich in natural resources. Realizing how quickly the sea lanes might be closed, we dispatched as many as possible of our students back to their homes or to their assignments. For those for whom it was impossible to get passage, we established a camp 30 kilometers from the city, with sufficient land for huts and gardens. We knew that if the Japanese would not soon stop, Makassar's fortifications would be tested. We wanted none of our students to face the already infamous shock troops, should invasion come. These shock troops were the first waves of invading soldiers who, by their cruelty and heinous practices, paralyzed the inhabitants with fear. It was very reassuring when the BBC News broadcast that a new British battleship, the HMS Prince of Wales, had been dispatched with all haste to the Far East, to be joined en route by the veteran battle cruiser HMS Repulse, which was somewhere in the Indian Ocean. It was also confirmed that a new aircraft carrier, the Indomitable, would be sent to reinforce the British fleet. Convoys of troop carriers also began to converge on Singapore, reputed to be the strongest naval base in the world. Australian ships en route to Singapore disembarked their youthful cargo of soldiers in Makassar. Aware that few of them could speak Indonesian, we went to the city to offer our services as interpreters while they bought souvenirs and trinkets for sweethearts and family back home. They were so young, so confident, so full of swaggering courage, too young to fall victim to the kamikaze pilots and the sons of Bushido. Such young confidence ought not to be shattered so soon. Such young courage ought not to be tried immediately to the breaking point. Many never lived to carry home their gifts of love. Those who returned had grown old long before their time in the prison camps of Singapore. Winston Churchill, in The Hinge of Fate, a volume in his Second World War, admits that the sinking of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse was the most direct shock he experienced during the whole course of the war. It was a shock suffered by everyone who had counted on those modern warships to turn back the tide of Japanese victories. Psychologically, the Japanese victory in the Gulf of Siam was shattering. Through the radio broadcast describing the victory, we again became poignantly aware of kamikaze pilots. "We fear what we do not understand," became the watchword of the times. We did not understand what kind of fatalistic brainwashing gives birth to suicide pilots. What defense is there against men who dive their planes into enemy ships in the arms of sure death? Our radio gave graphic eyewitness accounts of the kamikaze attacks and the sinking of the ships where they lay in the roads of Singapore, unable to maneuver to safety. We prayed earnestly for counsel from the mouth of the Lord. Russell was asked to conduct a week of special meetings at the Chinese church in Makassar. The British Vice Consul, Mr. Lee, was the interpreter. The Lord blessed, and there were those who accepted Christ as their Savior, others who sought a spiritual renewal. God met many hearts and prepared them for the days ahead.